Welcome to the Clergy Keynote at this year's Doxacon. Just a reminder that if something you hear during the talk makes you think of a question you'd like to ask the speaker, you can use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen during the talk to ask your question. Our Clergy Keynote speaker this year is the Very Reverend Father Dr. David Subu, priest at Protection of the Holy Mother of God Orthodox Church in Falls Church, Virginia, better known as St. Mary's, which is where we are broadcasting from. Father David is best known at Doxacon, though, for his geek orthodoxy and for being the co-founder of Doxacon. At the very first Doxacon, Father David presented on the Golden Path from Frank Herbert's Dune series. Tonight, he presents that talk's sequel, One More Blasphemy Remains, Memory, Prescience, Possession, and Abomination in Frank Herbert's Dune Saga. With the new Dune film out in theaters, the timing for this talk could not be more perfect in relation to the franchise. But the talk's focus on the guarding of the mind in the tradition of the Desert Fathers and the Philokalia looks to be even more relevant for Christians in our current cultural environment, as we find ourselves bombarded with conflicting voices, just as Alia and the twins are bombarded with the voices of their conflicting ancestors. Father David.
Thank you very much, Cindy, and thanks everybody who's joining us today live, who's joining us online, who's going to participate with this material later on YouTube or whatever recording. Just to let you know, there are 3 points during the talk at which I will pause and offer some questions for personal reflection. I'm not going to give you a lot of time in the live session to do that, so if you want to, I recommend taking a screenshot or a snapshot of those questions when they appear on the screen so that you can keep them for later use. So, let us begin. The mystery of life isn't a problem to solve, but a reality to experience. In the early 1960s, Frank Herbert began writing a series of stories that would eventually become the 3-part novel Dune in 1965, which slowly built a following, often by word of mouth, and followed by 5 sequels, eventually became the best-selling science fiction series in history, and still is as far as I'm aware. Many of the ideas and images of Dune were co-opted later by other filmmakers, most notably George Lucas in the Star Wars films. In 1984, Dune got its own treatment by David Lynch, an adaptation which opened the novels to a new generation of readers like myself, even if, in hindsight, that film is a bit of a mess. In 2000, the Sci-Fi Channel developed a made-for-TV miniseries that was a faithful adaptation of the novel, in spite of, shall we say, some odd costuming choices which viewers have either come to love or hate. In 2003, they followed up the very successful miniseries with a sequel, Children of Dune, which combined the novels of Dune Messiah from 1969 and Children of Dune from 1976, with a standout performance, by the way, by a young James McAvoy as Leto II. And of course, just last month, American audiences were treated to the long-awaited and pandemic-delayed theatrical release of Dune Part 1 by Denis Villeneuve. I highly recommend that film as well. It's a strong adaptation of the story. It gives it the epic quality and the gravitas that it deserves. But I also reserve the right to withhold my final judgment until I see Dune Part 2. So Denis, get out there, get back to work. So as Cindy mentioned, in 2013, our parish hosted the first ever Doxacon, and it was my pleasure to be just one of the regular presenters, not the keynote. And I gave my first talk about Dune. In many ways, having a conference like this to hear talks like that and about these subjects that we love in a theological way, in a faith-based way, was part of the inspiration for having Doxacon in the first place. I always felt, though, that I still had more to say about Frank Herbert's Dune series, and so I was very surprised but happy when our Doxacon team asked me to give the Clergy keynote this year. I suspect, though, it's more because they knew I was available and I couldn't say no. So, in any case, this talk, tongue-in-cheek, is entitled "One More Blasphemy Remains," after the dying words of one of the beloved characters in Children of Dune. My talk will not be really about blasphemy, in case you were hoping for some reason for that, but it will focus on more than just the first Dune novel or Dune movie. It will encompass the first 3 novels in particular, which kind of stand as a trilogy of their own. And again, if you want to see a good adaptation of these 3 novels, and you don't want to wait for Denis to finish his work, go back to the sci-fi series and you'll get a complex telling of the story that gives a fullness to it. My talk is an exploration of one of the major themes of the novels, the danger of becoming entangled in either the past or the future, and how embracing uncertainty and the freedom to choose is at the heart of our human experience. Our conference theme is virtuous decision-making. This theme is also a major concern in the Dune series. But if you are unfamiliar with Dune, let me summarize. Let me give you a brief introduction. Dune is basically the classic tale of a troubled young teen, Paul Atreides, who moves begrudgingly to a new and unfamiliar neighborhood where he struggles to fit in as he falls in love with the girl of his dreams, all the while facing the family upheavals so common to many. Add to this a few twists, such as tripping out on psychoactive substances, riding giant sandworms through the desert, accepting the mantle of a galactic messiah, and starting an interstellar jihad that results in the death of tens of billions. You know, basic teen drama. So who is this Paul Atreides? There he is. Wait, no, what? Who? That's not our Paul Atreides, is it? There he is, Timothée Chalamet in the lead role for this film. In spite of the epic storylines which whirl around the young Paul Atreides, though, Dune and its immediate sequels are really still the story of a family trying to hold it together against impossible pressures. It's these kind of difficulties for which young Paul was born and bred, but it doesn't mean that they're in any way simple or easy for him to endure and accept. Quite literally, he is the product of a centuries-long secret breeding program to produce a human being capable of having the mental experience of being many places at once, simultaneously, the past, the present, and future. But first, let's talk about the past. Dune is unusual as a work of science fiction in that hyper-technology, like warp speed engines and AI supercomputers, are not really a major plot device, or at least not until the non-canonical works of post-mortem. Instead, there is a rejection of these tropes in favor of a human-centered technology, the technology of the mind. This is all made possible by the existence of the spice harvested on the desert planet Arrakis, based loosely on the psilocybin found in so-called magic mushrooms. It was the 60s, and Frank was exploring. The spice of Arrakis allowed humans to expand their mental capabilities into the realm of true sci-fi shenanigans. Space travel was made possible by specially enhanced spice-addicted navigators capable of folding space with their minds, and a secretive sisterhood of feared witches or nuns or some kind of people known as the Bene Gesserit use the spice to awaken in themselves the memories of all those that came before them, and also to share their memories with those who will come after. This genetic or other memory, as it's called, will become a major part of the storyline as the Lady Jessica in the new movie, played brilliantly, by the way, by Rebecca Ferguson, when she awakens to it as she undergoes the initiation process as a full Reverend Mother of the Bene Gesserit. You'll have to see Dune Part 2 for that part. As she lives among the Fremen. The Fremen are the native inhabitants of Arrakis, or Dune as they know it. And her son, Paul, who we've seen, who is known amongst the Fremen as Muad'Dib, also becomes the first male Bene Gesserit, essentially, able to awaken this same power within him, making him at least the beginning of the fulfillment of their hoped-for Messiah figure, the Kwisatz Haderach, but then also fulfilling the prophecies of the Fremen tribes as the Lisan al-Gaib, the voice from the outer world. And he, in fact, tells them, and he's much more. Oh, there he is. Wait, that's the old Paul. This other memory serves as a source of incredible knowledge. It's like being able to call up any one of your ancestors, essentially back to the beginning of time, and to learn directly from their experiences, to in a way be able to experience them for yourself. And so, not surprisingly, it's also very dangerous to the uninitiated and the unprepared. And this becomes clear when the third member of the family to have this power is revealed to be Paul's sister, Alia. She had that experience awakened within her while she was still in utero, in the womb of Lady Jessica. And that is a choice that she did not make that will nevertheless have tragic consequences down the road. For those of you who are suspect of Jason Momoa, he also did a good job, very good job. I was pleased. So for Frank Herbert, memory exists for both weal and for woe. It can help the protagonist, but it can also entangle them. How so? Well, let's first consider how we can make good use of the gift of memory, both individual and collective. In Christianity in particular, we have the concept of anamnesis, recollection or remembrance. It is the term that Orthodox Christians frequently use in reference to the central act of the divine liturgy. And it comes from the words of the Lord in Luke 22:19. This is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. Anamnesin in the Greek. The church fathers, who were influenced also by Platonic philosophy, which had this idea, understood the faculty of remembrance as more than just simply being able to call up data, facts, and figures. Liturgy is likewise more than just a religious reenactment or some kind of pious pantomime of the past. Anamnesis, properly understood, is an awakening to a knowledge that exists a priori, a knowledge that always has been and always will be truth and always will be knowable and discoverable by those who have the means. In the anamnesis of the liturgy, therefore, we are called to be awakened to the reality of Jesus Christ as the King of glory, eternally worshiped with the Father and the Spirit. We step into the divine liturgy, which is eternally being celebrated in the heavens. This is what the fathers mean when they talk about the knowledge of God. Those who are saints, starting with the prophets and the apostles, are those who have entered into the eternal memory of God and behold Christ in glory. Our liturgical year is one continual cycle of anamnesis through which the events of the life of Christ become present to us and meaningful to us in ways beyond simple history, inviting us to become a part of them on a higher level. The saving events of the gospel become part of our present reality. We partake of the life of Christ. We are baptized in Christ. We are buried with him, and we rise again with him. We become clothed with Christ, etc. It's also why in the liturgy of St. John Chrysostom we hear these startling words, remembering all those things which have come to pass for us, the cross, the grave, the third day resurrection, the ascension into heaven, the sitting at the right hand of the Father, and the second and glorious coming. In the divine liturgy, we're remembering things that even haven't happened yet in our time frame. But that's because we're entering into that anamnesis of God, which is outside time itself. Thus, it could be said that Christians are the people who truly remember. Memory is sacred to us. It's the path by which we enter into salvation and into eternal life. Every Orthodox Christian funeral, for example, ends with the singing of a simple hymn, Memory Eternal. It means so much more than what we normally think it does. But there's also a dark side of memory, a shadow memory, if you will. What happens when the memories of the past become an oppressive force, leading us into darkness instead of light? While it is a challenge that Paul has to deal with, it's the true struggle of the preborn in Dune that brings this idea to life. Who are the preborn? That's people like Alia and other characters that we'll see later in the series. Alia, though, is the first, essentially. By participating in that initiation in the womb, she was awakened to full consciousness while still an infant, without the benefit of a fully developed sense of self as a buffer against the many memories and personalities of her ancestors, good and bad. Thus, never able to truly be a child, the preborn Alia suffers from the weight of being exposed to too much knowledge too soon. In many ways, I would say she's like a survivor of childhood abuse or trauma, exposed to the tragedy of human suffering and evil before ever being sufficiently able to process those experiences with wisdom and without harm. In such survivors of all types, the voices of those who do harm can and often do speak louder than our own, making it hard for us to believe in the goodness of the world, of God, and even ourselves. And spiritually, this reflects for us the ongoing story of the fall of Adam and Eve, who by being exposed to the knowledge of good and evil before they were sufficiently mature, lost their childlike innocence and fell from grace. In many ways, we are all under the cloud of shadow memory, subject to the burden of our ancestral sin, quick to lose our innocence through our own sins, and perpetuating the cycle anew. So this time I'd like to offer you some questions for reflection. With the stern look of Gurney Halleck. 1, how does the inheritance of the experiences of my ancestors influence me positively today? How can I draw strength from my memories of them? 2, how do these experiences influence me negatively? How does my memory limit my ability to think and grow as a human being? What are the negative ideas that I've internalized because of them? And 3, in what ways does sacred past continue to live meaningfully in my life? In what ways am I a steward of memory? This has to do with how we live out our faith. Hopefully you'll also have time to talk about these questions in the breakout sessions. But I'll move on now. Let's talk about the tragedy of Alia. As she grows into adulthood, she bears the burdens of trying to rule the Imperium in her brother's name in the novel Children of Dune. Once a sweet and precocious Fremen child, the murder of Baron Harkonnen notwithstanding, at 4 years of age, she grows into a wounded and conflicted woman struggling with the impossible expectations of living up to her brother and her family's legacy, as well as the pain of her mother's abandonment. Left with no one who can understand her, she relies more on the spice to try to replicate her brother's powers and visions, to control the present, to manipulate the future. But she only falls deeper and deeper into despair and insanity. As she does so, the voices of that other memory begin to assault her, wanting to take the center of her consciousness, to assert themselves like possessing demons. Her final solution is one of utter despair. She makes a deal with the memory presence of the now dead Baron Harkonnen, her victim and victimizer, who has the force of personality to drive back that legion of other voices haunting her. all for the price of a little corner of her consciousness and the indulging of pleasures of the flesh whenever she can get around to it for his sake. Not much. It's a classic deal with the devil. The solution buys Alia the short-term stability that she needs, but it costs her everything. She becomes what is called an abomination. She's fully possessed, no longer herself, really just the outward manifestation of the Baron Harkonnen living through her, no longer able to be the person who was recognized and loved by her own family, no longer a person who can love others in return. Well played in the miniseries here by Daniela Amavia, by the way. The lesson of Alia is a very powerful warning for us as Christians. We know that we struggle not against flesh and blood, but against spiritual powers. These spirits very rarely manifest themselves in any way that we would see them as such, but usually and frequently through the intrusion and provocations of thoughts, of images, of temptations. Also, through the triggering of memory. Our struggle is within. Without the ability, though, to root themselves in our memory, temptations lose much of the power they have to affect us. So the guarding of our senses and our minds and our memories is one of the key disciplines of spiritual life in the Christian tradition. When we don't take such steps, those temptations grow into sins. Sins grow into habits. Habits become passions, which shape us, possess us, and drive our character and eventually our destiny. Not surprisingly, spiritual awareness and clarity is a major theme in Dune as well. The Fremen actually epitomize the Stoic way of life, which is very much adopted by the Church Fathers and the Ascetic Fathers. They represent the ability to repress their impulses in the harsh desert, and it's essential for their strength and their survival as a people. To remain free men, the Fremen understand that they must restrain themselves and not become decadent like the water-soft off-worlders who are corrupting their beloved homeworld of Dune. St. Paul says to us in Galatians chapter 5, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty by which Christ has made us free, and do not be entangled again with a yoke of bondage." Christians are called to be fremen, free people, free men and women, not through decadent libertinism or selfish self-will, which leads us again into the slavery of sin. We become truly free by the use of self-control and dispassion. These are virtues which must be cultivated. We do so through prayer and fasting, through the guarding of our thoughts, and thus we bring our wayward flesh under the dominion of the Spirit. The process of moving from passion to dispassion is profoundly exemplified as well in the Dune series by what is probably the most well-known kind of aphorism from the series, which is the Bene Gesserit Litany Against Fear. Why don't you read it with me together? I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me, and when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. So with that litany in mind, I offer you the next series of questions for personal reflection. Beast Raban is my example of the passionate soul. How does fear affect my ability to think clearly and make good decisions? What tactics do I have for facing my fear and letting it pass through me? In what ways have intrusive thoughts and passions possessed me? How do they keep me from being my true self? And how does self-restraint or a lack thereof affect the choices that I make and the outcome of my actions? Go ahead and record as you see fit or think about it. And we move on to the future. One of the major plot devices as well in the Dune series is not just things like other memory, but also prescience, the ability to have foresight, prophetic foresight and vision of the future. And it raises the question, how does a prophet see the future? Is the future written in stone? Is there only one possible future? Or does trying to see the future, in fact, in some way lure us into creating the future? The new film does an excellent job, by the way, of showing how prescience manifests itself in the mind of young Paul Atreides. Instead of showing him one path forward with absolute certainty, he sees many potential futures, some of which come true, but others in totally different ways than he suspects. And he learns from these different possibilities in such a way that when the time of fulfillment comes, the point of crisis or decision comes, he has some insight, he is somehow prepared, even if the way it's turning out is exactly the opposite of what his vision showed him, which is actually really cool storytelling in the film and really good, movie making for us as an audience. As Paul develops his awareness through the story, he's able to see more and more clearly how each choice he makes moves him along one trajectory or another. He must increasingly make decisions that lead towards futures with inescapably terrible consequences attached to them. Yet with the awareness that some of those unbearable choices are unavoidable, lest he choose a path which has even worse catastrophe down the road. In fact, that's a major part of the whole arc of the entire series. And that's why at the end of Dune Part 1, where he is faced with the opportunity to choose stay or leave the planet, with, as his mother suggests, he decides, kind of following the motto of the Atreides family, here I stay. And he knows what it will cost him. He knows that he is setting himself on a path that will lead to the jihad that I mentioned. But he also knows that if he doesn't act in this way, worse things could also happen. Nevertheless, it's not easy. Though framed as a protagonist in all of this, Paul is both hero and villain. That is to say, he's a sympathetic figure that we can relate to, but he's also one that we have to take as a warning. The consequences of his choices lead to incredible suffering for billions of people, at least fictional people. Frank Herbert, though, goes to great lengths to build up this myth of a Messiah. That was his stated intent in writing the story. But then he turns around in the second novel and the third novel, too, and proceeds to completely deconstruct that character. It actually irritated a lot of people when it came out, because they're like, you built up this hero figure, this great man figure, and now you've totally kind of undercut everything that we thought it was about in the second and third movies, which was actually brilliant. Yeah. Paul is both swept up in the future he foresees, yet at the same time he knows he's intimately responsible for it. He struggles with knowing that he has become trapped by his choices, and the only way out for him is to disengage, as he says, to deconstruct the myth, to undo the damage as much as he can. And even though as he faces his fear and his guilt, he's still making choices out of fear and guilt, and he doesn't escape the problems of the original visions. So having achieved victory and subduing the known universe, he finds himself more and more a prisoner as the virtues that he fought for and led others to die for rapidly evaporate before his eyes on the sands of Arrakis. Like Alia, Paul Atreides is really a tragic figure, a figure of ancient tragedy, in this case, one in the mold of Oedipus Rex, who becomes trapped by the destiny he was actively trying to avoid. And like Sophocles' proud protagonist, he only can see the truth of it after he loses his eyes and wanders into the desert blind and alone, leaving the next generation to try to pick up the pieces. For Christians, these ideas can be very challenging because we too are heirs of a prophetic tradition. Christ himself underwent the agony of the garden as he wrestled with the knowledge of what he was about to endure on the cross, and it was enough to make him sweat blood. For those who do not believe in the resurrection, he still appears as a tragic figure who was caught up in his own myth, a false Messiah, a scandal, a stumbling block. But for those of us who believe, it's a very different story. The relationship of Jesus Christ to the prophecies, though, concerning him is a curious one. At times, the prophecies about him were fulfilled without anything that, visibly he would have personally done, right? The time and place of his birth, the behavior and actions of the soldiers at the foot of the cross, etc. But there are other times in which he very intentionally takes actions which will be interpreted as fulfillments of prophecy, such as riding the donkey into Jerusalem, right? Or claiming to be the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven, a claim to divinity, which will be the immediate precipitating cause of him being delivered up for crucifixion. From a dogmatic perspective, it's not really that problematic for us. As perfect God and perfect man, there's no reason that Christ can't be both the giver of the prophecy and the fulfiller of the prophecy. He can both foretell it to the prophets, and he can be the agent of its unfolding at the time. And for most of the time, he seems to be acting out of complete certainty of what he is and why he's doing it, and why shouldn't he? Yet, at a crucial moment in the Gospels, Christ condescends to our human condition and our human weakness and shares with us the profound experience of uncertainty in the Garden of Gethsemane by saying, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me. Nevertheless, not as I will, but as you will. Not my will, but thy will be done." This becomes the ultimate Christian prayer of offering ourselves to God in faith. And faith can only exist in an environment of uncertainty, vulnerability, and surrender. In Children of Dune, Paul himself rises from the desert years later as a blind preacher, like Oedipus at Colonus, to finally complete the end of his myth. His message, reject the quest for perfect foreknowledge. Reject the search for certainty in all things. Because the longing for certainty is really about the longing for control, to be God in place of God. It's the same fruit of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil which tempted our ancestors in the first place. Adam and Eve grasped for the power of certainty of knowledge and brought upon themselves the cup of suffering and death. But God grants them and us blessed uncertainty through our physical death, through the end of this life, through the changes that we suffer, so that we might not be trapped in that unending torment of absolute certainty, the absolute certainty of our fallen state and our alienation from God, a future that left to ourselves we would create for ourselves again and again by turning away from God's love and taking the path of fear and distrust. Every judgment teeters on the brink of error. To claim absolute knowledge is to become monstrous. Knowledge is an unending adventure at the edge of uncertainty. I love that quote. The Messiah came to restore the first man, the first Adam, by accepting the principle of uncertainty and surrendering to God's will in the second garden, and willingly taking upon himself the cup of our suffering. Christ, as a second Adam, healed our broken human nature. He made it possible for us to dwell in a future guided by love and faith and truth, in communion with God, not in rebellion. Starting today, in fact, and lived with each and every moment of our lives without need for control. The tragic story of House Atreides is just another version of the same story of our hurting, fearful humanity. The people of Dune desired a Messiah, but the one they got was not the one they expected. In fact, as Muad'Dib tells them, he's not even their Messiah. He's but a forerunner, preparing the way for mankind. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, we read that God hath made everything beautiful in his time. Also he hath set eternity in man's heart, yet so that no man can find out the work that God maketh from the beginning to the end. As children of God, we are called to dwell in the constant tension between past and future, memory and prophecy, certainty and uncertainty. And only in that place of paradox, which is to truly dwell in the many places at once, can we truly grasp what it means to have faith, such that the mystery of life is no longer a problem to be solved, but a reality to be experienced. Your final questions for reflection. How do our expectations of the future and projections of what we can be shape what we become? How has the quest for future certainty limited your ability to truly experience the present moment? How does faith free us from the need to know everything with absolute certainty? How does faith free you in living your life? It's been my great pleasure to share with you tonight my humble musings on Frank Herbert's Dune series. His work continues to challenge me to truly look beyond what is self-satisfying and to inspire me to seek a noble purpose in all that I do or say. And in this way, he is doing his creator's work of imaging truth through the waters of creativity. I hope you are able to take some of the questions that I've posed tonight and discuss them in breakout sessions, or perhaps if you do personal journaling, or maybe even to help you prepare for when you go to confession, if that's part of your tradition. May we each contribute our waters of creativity to the community, to the tribe, to the sietch, to the betterment of us all. Bless the maker and his water. Bless the coming and going of him. May his passage cleanse the world. May he keep the world for his people. Amen. Thank you very much. And thank you, Frank.
Thank you, Father David. Don't forget that you can ask Father David questions by putting a question in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. We certainly look forward to having questions, but I'll try to start off with maybe one or two questions of my own. As you were talking about the Fremen, you were talking about them sort of as an example of self-restraint and stoicism. And yet, after the coming of Paul and his mother, Paul gets carried away with a jihad that I, as far as I can tell in the book, seems to be driven largely by the expectations of the Fremen themselves. I was wondering if you could speak to what happens to the Fremen in the wake of the Lisan al-Gaib.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. You know, it's like lighting a fire, and that's, he realizes, after the fact that the price was the price worth it, and I think there's a lot of regret about what he felt it required to establish peace in the Imperium. And that's why, Frank Herbert doesn't shy away from painting, the end of Dune. It's like, yay, he defeats the Harkonnens and he defeats the Emperor. Everything's going to be okay, right? And that's kind of how fairy tales go. But this is not a fairy tale. This is a very serious examination. And so in Dune Messiah and Children of Dune, we see the price of that kind of naivete, that sometimes, the devil might actually be better than the one that's coming. And I think it's one of the things that we continue to struggle with historically as a human species.
Okay. We now do have some questions from the attendees. You mentioned the litany against fear and how fear can distort our decisions, while also mentioning the need for self-restraint. Is there a tension there, since fear of consequences can assist us in developing restraint?
Fear of consequences I don't know if it's the same kind of fear. I mean, it's, recognizing if I stick my hand in the box the first time, I don't know what's going to happen, like Paul did, but the second time, shame on me. It's not necessarily a fear. It's just awareness. It's maturity. So if I know that something is a trap, or if I know that something can hurt me, it's not so much that I'm afraid of it anymore. It's just that I respect the danger that it poses. The only fear that really is a positive fear from a Christian point of view is the fear of God, right? Because all other fears imply fear of punishment or fear of torment, and perfect love casts out fear. So the fear of God is understood by the church fathers, at least, as a completely different kind of fear. It's not the kind of fear that brings total obliteration. It's the kind of awe and respect and wonder for the awesomeness of God, basically, that keeps us directed in the right way. It's more on the strategy level than the tactical level, if you will, to go back to my question.
There's actually a follow-up question to that in the chat box. Does fear of consequences keep us from making mistakes?
Yeah, again, I don't think it's fear of consequences does not keep us from making mistakes, because there's plenty of times where we might make a mistake through inaction or through being too conservative in our actions. By being too afraid to take a risk, we might actually cause some harm or some hurt to ourselves. We might actually fail to kind of live up to our purpose that God has given us. So no, fear does not safeguard us. It can be a warning, but it's not a guarantee.
Okay, here's another question. What do you think of Herbert's choice to include spoilers for what will happen in many chapters by including Iriolon's reflections at the start of the chapter? Do you think he was intentionally simulating prescience in the reader?
Oh, that's a great question. Absolutely. For those of you who don't know, what that's referring to is that every chapter of each book in the Dune series starts with kind of a little, I don't know, what's the term? Like a citation, just kind of like how every slide I did was like, I was trying to do the same thing, basically. It would be like bits, like quotations from fictional histories written long after the fact. And it does kind of create a dramatic expectation that you're like, oh, I'm reading the story, but this is suggesting that it's going to go really, a bad way. And it builds that sense of impending doom. Now, obviously, you can't do that in a film, for example. So I thought that, Villeneuve went through the story and really had to come up with a different way to accomplish that. And so he did a really good job of just creating that just continuing sense of impending doom. That at first I was like, I don't like it. It's rushing the story a little too much. It's not lingering over the fun parts that I wanted to see. But that was necessary, I think, to create the same feeling of prescience, if you will, impending future. Great question.
Another question. Ghani uses the memory of her parents to protect her against other memory. Would you say relying on the saints is analogous to what Ghani does?
Okay, so for those who don't know who Ghani is, Ghanima Paul and Shani end up having twin children. They are preborn children, like Alia, because of the circumstances of their birth. And Leto II, who was played by James McAvoy that I mentioned, is Leto, his son, and his twin sister is Ghanima. And both as preborn have to come up with their own ways of kind of figuring out how to resist those inner voices. Now, the strength that they have with each other, this actually goes back to the talk we had this morning about Doctor Who, how on his own Doctor Who gets into trouble, but when he has a companion, the companion balances and checks him, right, and helps his compass. And Leto and Ghanima serve that purpose for each other at first. They are the community But eventually they have to understand themselves as communal beings within themselves because of the presence of these other voices. And Ganima has to rely, in many respects, on the presence of Lady Jessica as a ancestor, even though Lady Jessica is still alive in the story. The memory of her in her head kind of protects her and guides her. For Leto, he has a much more difficult path, and he draws upon kind of this ill-defined, ancestor king who will help him rule with the kind of ruthless efficiency that he's going to need to get through this ordeal that he has to go through. But in many ways, yes, for us as Christians, we don't have these other memories, and we shouldn't go seeking them voices in our heads by any means. But most certainly, the saints are the sacred dead and our holy family members in Christ who can be guardians for us and guides for us through their example, through their prayers and intercessions, if you come from a tradition like us in the Orthodox Church that believe in such things. So yes, they do that, but it's not something that we want to sit there and pursue conversations inside of our head with beings that we hope are saints or angels. That would be considered to be a poor use of our mind and a dangerous use of the imagination from a patristic point of view.
Okay. Jumping off the previous question about fear of consequences, what is the difference between fear and humility in this context?
Fear is rooted in a kind of a negative uncertainty, right? The unpleasant experience of being uncertain about things, not knowing what's going to happen, being afraid of the future, and not knowing what's going to happen. Humility is a kind of it's a different axis, if you will. Humility is acting with an awareness that that's okay, that you don't need to be right, you don't need to be certain, you don't need to be in charge. Humility is the attitude of acceptance that allows a person to face their fear and let it pass through them so that only they remain. The ego is what attaches to those fears. I've got to do something. I've got to make something happen. I've got to control the outcome. That's egotism. The litany of fear requires you to let all that go and be humble enough to just recognize that's not me. That's not my place. That's not my job. It's just fear. It's going to go. It's going to come. It's going to go. I can't change that. But what I can change is who I am. And that only I will be remaining. Small, quiet, still, dispassionate.
Okay. Here's a question that I'm not sure I fully understand, but what is your interpretation of the return of Omnius and the thinking machine's ultimate threat Paul sees as needing to be prepared ahead? And also, do you also feel a bit sorry for Duncan Idaho as the books go on?
Okay, so again, for those who don't know, the long story arc, Frank Herbert died in 1986, I think, and kind of left the series on a cliffhanger in the book Chapter House Dune, with the characters fleeing off into space, chased by an enemy that they didn't know, and left all the readers just kind of, okay, well, what was that all about? That was weird, and very unrequited. Later, his son found stowed away somewhere, basically the notes and the outlines of where he was going to take the story and kind of all the background information about it. And the background story is that the reason in the Dune universe that they have no supercomputers is because at a time in the distant human past, human beings created thinking machines, AI, that turned around and enslaved humanity to the point of almost extinction, kind of like a Terminator story, if you will. And there was the first jihad, intergalactic jihad, if you will, was called the Butlerian Jihad, which was the throwing off the shackles of the thinking machines. And so from then on, they said, thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. That was a form of idolatry. And you could not do that because it would enslave people again. So human beings had to pick up the slack. That's why they have mentats in the story. Those are the guys that are variously weird fellows who are the basic human computers. That's why they have space, the guild navigators who fold space instead of the engines and so forth, and the Bene Gesserit. All of those are developments so that people don't have to rely on technology, but they can rely on human beings. So in the distant future, basically, of where Frank Herbert was going, the unseen enemy that was chasing them through the galaxy, basically, that was never encountered in his writings, turns out to be the remnant of the thinking machines that had been festering somewhere in the deepest ends of space and finally had come back to get revenge and to wipe out humanity once and for all. And this is what's being referred to in the earlier novels as Kralazek, the Typhoon struggle, the kind of Armageddon, the final conflict between humanity and these, what are essentially bodiless powers of AI. And so it's kind of corny sounding. It wasn't well executed by Brian Herbert and Kevin Anderson, I'm not a fan of their prequels and sequels. I think it's not near the level of Frank Herbert's writing. So sorry if you like them. I'm not a gatekeeper. I'm not trying to say anybody should or shouldn't, but I wasn't that excited. But I did like that they dealt with the story. And part of the story is that Duncan Idaho, played by Jason Momoa, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen or read the books, but he comes back time and time again as a clone version of himself, who also gets the ability to have this memory of his past lives, until he's had so many lives, like 10,000 years or whatever, 4,000 years later or whatever it is, it's thousands of years later, that he is the only human being who can competently interface with the Omnius and the AIs and kind of be a buffer that saves humanity. So Duncan Idaho is actually the Messiah. He's the Messiah in the story. It's not the Atreides at all. So go figure. I spoiled the whole series for you, but whatever. That's what you're here to find out, I guess. So I don't feel sorry for Duncan, because in a way it was kind of cool. It's like, yeah, he is a really cool character in the books, and if they keep making movies with Jason Momoa, it could be very interesting to see how he plays that. So we'll see.
Any thoughts about how fear and prophecy as themes work together with the ecological themes of Dune, especially as they pertain to a centuries-long transforming project?
The ecology of Dune is tied up, yes, with the prophecies. Part of the story is the messianic promise that is brought to the Fremen is that their planet will be transformed into a garden again, into a green planet. And that's part of their longing. It's the natural human desire to return to paradise. So it's definitely part of the prophetic storyline. And I think that's true for us as human beings in general. We long for a paradisical earth where there's no more, catastrophes and wars and diseases and pandemics and so forth. We long for that return to simplicity. We have, a romanticism for pastoral life. That's part of that. So it's definitely connected and definitely involved. I don't know if I can connect it to fear or fear and prophecy being connected, but certainly I think that a lot of our anxiety in the modern age comes from our fear of ecological problems, of sociological problems, ecological problems that are global scale and beyond the control of any individual person or even group of people. And so, yes, looking for certainty that this will fix it, or this is the answer, is a dangerous temptation for us, because solutions create problems, even while they're solving the problems that they were setting out to solve. They create new complexities that can lead to even worse situations, which is part of that problem of the danger of prescience in Dune.
Okay. Our next question offers an interpretation and basically asks what you think of that interpretation.
All right.
So here's what we've got here. I've been used to considering Dune as an anti-religious book, since the Messiah leads to terrible war, and the analog to the Catholic Church, the Bene Gesserit, are scheming and not on your side. Would you agree with that, or to what extent would you agree?
That question was a major part of my first talk, which somewhere used to exist online, a recording of it, at least an audio recording of it. But that was our old website, so I don't know where it is anymore. And if I can find it, I'll post it. But one of the things that Dune is, it is not anti-religious because it never escapes the power of religion. It's still a messianic story. That's the great thing about the Messiah story is it really is the human story, and it's inescapable. Even when people try to deconstruct it or overturn it, they always end up coming back to it in a new form. It's kind of like a dialectical problem. So it's religious critique. I call it religious fantasy and religious critique in my first talk. It's religious fantasy as opposed to science fiction, because it's really a fantasy story using the categories of religion. And then it's also a critique of religion, of prophets, of organized religions, of bureaucracies. It's a criticism of society as a whole, of course. So I don't take it as anti-religious. That's why I said at the end, I love the Dune series because it challenges my conscience as a religious person. As a priest, priests don't get a lot of good press in the Dune series. They're not well respected, I have to say. But it challenges me not to be like that, right? To not be self-satisfying, pharisaical, autocratic, all the things that all the weaknesses that organized religion can be subject to. So I think it's a worthy series of books to read just for that purpose alone, if you're a believing Christian, because again, it is science fiction. It's not trying to say this is how things really are. It's just a story. So, sticks and stones, right? But I find it to be a great test for my conscience. If I listen to it and I say, yeah, I've done that, or yeah, I need to be a little more aware of maybe how I use language, or how I treat truth and my certainty in my own knowledge.
Okay, it's almost 8 o'clock, but we do have another question that looks like it's a good question. So I'm going to ask it, and then we will go to our breakouts. Since Tolkien is known to have looked unfavorably upon Dune, where do you see the greatest difference between Middle-earth's story and that of Dune?
I love Tolkien. I'm a big Tolkien nerd too, but I mean, I don't believe in gatekeeping. I mean, Doxacon is all about not gatekeeping. When we first started Doxacon, people wanted us to tell them what would be kosher to read and watch and what would be okay for Christians. And that's not our job here. Our job is not to tell people what's the best stuff or what you should think. It's to challenge you to think about these things seriously for yourself and try to come up with them. Tolkien didn't like a lot of things. That's fine. He's not the end-all, be-all of fiction in the world. So I'll just leave it at that. Respect to everybody.
Thank you very much, Father David. And we will now be going to our breakouts, which you can find on the attendee page. You can find the links to those. And we'll be back tomorrow morning for Divine Liturgy at 8 o'clock. And I believe our lay keynote is at 9:30. So we'll see you tomorrow.